27 years. That's how long it took Russia to turn one Cold War battlecruiser back into a warship. And by the time it finally happened in June of 2026, the world had changed around it. But that was the easy part. We're talking about the Admiral Nakhimov, a 28,000-ton nuclear-powered missile cruiser that just wrapped up the final phase of its sea trials after a refit that took so long that sailors who will crew it were born after the ship was already sitting in a shipyard rusting. Today, we're asking the question Russia's own state media would very much like us not to ask. Did the Kremlin just field one of the most heavily armed surface combatants on the planet? Or did it spend billions of dollars and nearly 3 decades building the world's most expensive target? Let's start with what this ship actually is. The Admiral Nakhimov is one of 4 Kirov-class battlecruisers built by the Soviet Union, absolute monsters of the sea designed to hunt and kill American carrier strike groups on the open ocean. She was laid down in the 1980s and commissioned in 1988 under her original name, Kalinin. She then served for about a decade with the Soviet and then Russian Navy before being towed into the Sevmash shipyard up in Severodvinsk in 1999. Back then, it was billed as a routine overhaul. Nobody involved in that decision could have imagined that routine overhaul would still be dragging on in the 2020s. To understand why the Nakhimov sat there for so long, you have to understand just how broke and disorganized Russia was in the years after the Soviet collapse. The economy was in shambles, the ruble was worthless, and the naval command was left holding a fleet of extremely expensive Soviet toys with no money to maintain any of them. On top of that, a lot of the industrial base that actually built and serviced these ships wasn't even inside the new Russian Federation anymore. The Admiral Kuznetsov, Russia's only aircraft carrier, was built in a Ukrainian shipyard, and Russia basically had to make do after the Soviet breakup. So when a hull like the Nakhimov needed serious structural work, Russia didn't have the money and didn't fully have the means to do it properly. There were half-hearted conversations about restarting work in the 2000s, but nothing serious happened until the 2010s. The real modernization effort finally got a signature in 2013, with a formal contract worth about 50 billion rubles, roughly $1.5 billion at the time. The plan was about as ambitious as naval refits get. Instead of patching up old Soviet systems, engineers were going to gut the entire interior of the ship down to the bare hull, tear out miles of decaying Soviet-era wiring, rip out the obsolete missile tubes, and essentially rebuild a brand new warship. Moscow proudly announced the ship would be back in the fleet by 2018. That deadline, as you probably already guessed, came and went without so much as a splash. What actually happened once the shipyard workers started digging into that hull is a picture-perfect example of how badly a project can spiral once reality meets Soviet engineering. Structural frames that had been corroding quietly for decades needed to be replaced entirely. Welding techniques required to work on a hull of this age and size turned out to be far more specialized and time-consuming than planned. And perhaps the biggest headache of all was trying to bolt modern radar arrays and combat systems onto a superstructure that was designed around analog Cold War electronics. Every one of those problems pushed the timeline back further. 2018 became 2021, which became 2023, which became 2025. And here we are in 2026, watching a ship that was supposed to be finished before some of its future crew were even born. The costs followed the same trajectory as the timeline, which is to say straight up and to the right. That original 50 billion ruble contract eventually ballooned by roughly 400%, with unofficial estimates putting the final bill somewhere around 200 billion rubles. Convert that into dollars at anything close to a realistic exchange rate, and unofficial estimates place total costs somewhere between roughly $2 to $5 billion, depending on whose estimate you trust and when you're measuring it, spent on refitting a single hull. For context, that's enough money that could have gone a long way toward building or arming several smaller, more modern vessels, instead of pouring it all into one irreplaceable ship. And when the money for one ship starts spiraling that badly, something else usually has to give. In this case, it was the Nakhimov's own sister ship, the Pyotr Velikiy, or Peter the Great, the fourth and last operational Kirov-class cruiser still nominally in service. As the Nakhimov's refit ate up more and more of the Russian Navy's budget, plans to modernize the Pyotr Velikiy were quietly shelved. Russia effectively cannibalized one flagship's future to pay for the other's resurrection. So, even before we get to the question of combat effectiveness, there's a strategic cost here. The Soviet Union's original fleet of 4 Kirov-class monsters is now down to essentially one that anyone is planning to actually operate, since the Admiral Lazarev was scrapped back in 2021 and the Pyotr Velikiy is likely being decommissioned after Nakhimov returns to service. And even that's up for debate, as a report from 2023 suggested that the ship might be kept in service regardless. But beyond the ship's history, let's talk about what nearly 3 decades and several $1 billion actually bought, because on paper, the Admiral Nakhimov looks almost unstoppable. The original Nakhimov was built to carry 20 P-700 Granite anti-ship missiles, the weapon Soviet naval doctrine built entirely around, designed to launch mass strikes against American carrier battle groups from long range. Every single one of those launchers has been removed. In their place, engineers installed a universal vertical launch system, reportedly around 80 cells across 10 modules, capable of firing Caliber land attack and anti-ship cruise missiles, P-800 Onyx anti-ship missiles, and potentially the 3M-22 Zircon hypersonic missile. Add in the ship's long-range air defense cells, and total missile capacity across the vessel is estimated at roughly 170 to 180 missile cells. Whatever the exact final number turns out to be once she's fully accepted into service, this isn't a ship you want sailing toward you with hostile intent. The ship also runs on a combined nuclear and steam propulsion system, meaning her 2 KN-3 nuclear reactors give her essentially unlimited range and endurance, which matters enormously for the mission Russia actually has her in mind for, which we'll get to in a moment. Those reactors, by the way, sat cold for so long that restarting them was itself treated as a milestone, with the 2 reactors brought back online in December of 2024 and February of 2025 respectively, more than a decade after the modernization contract was signed. The ship didn't even leave Sevmash for its first trials until August 2025, and it didn't enter what the Russian Ministry of Transport called its final phase of sea trials until June 2026, after departing the shipyard in late May. Satellite trackers have spotted her running speed and navigation trials in the White Sea, throwing up a healthy wake as she puts the systems through their paces. If everything goes according to plan from here, and given this ship's history, that's a fairly large if, the Admiral Nakhimov could formally enter service with Russia's Northern Fleet sometime later in 2026 or into 2027. So here's the part Russian state media is going to lean on hard, and the part we need to push back on a little. This ship is not being positioned as a Black Sea combatant, and it's not being sent anywhere near Ukraine's coastline. Its intended role is as the flagship of the Northern Fleet, based around the Kola Peninsula, with the mission tied directly to protecting Russia's sea-based nuclear deterrent. Russia's ballistic missile submarines operate out of that region, and in wartime they're expected to retreat into heavily protected bastions in the Barents and Kara Seas. The Nakhimov's job, with its nuclear-powered endurance and its massive air defense loadout, is to help guard that bastion and screen those submarines from NATO submarines, aircraft, and surface ships. It is, in other words, being built for an entirely different war than the one currently raging in the Black Sea. Which brings us to the actual title of this video, and the uncomfortable argument that a growing number of naval analysts have been making since this ship first left the shipyard. Even considering that Nakhimov's real job is Arctic defense and not power projection in the Black Sea, the broader logic of pouring this much money and firepower into one irreplaceable hull runs directly against everything the war in Ukraine has taught the world about naval warfare over the last 4 years. For that, we need to talk about the cruiser Moskva. But before we do that, make sure to subscribe to The Military Show. We make daily videos that cover the history, present and future of warfare. In April 2022, Moskva was the flagship of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, a Slava-class missile cruiser that Russian sailors and propagandists alike treated as untouchable. Ukraine hit her with 2 domestically produced Neptune anti-ship missiles, and she sank, becoming the largest warship lost in combat by any navy in decades. The missiles that did it cost a tiny fraction of what the ship itself was worth, and the sinking clearly demonstrated the nature of the entire war, where big, expensive, prestige surface combatants were no longer the untouchable status symbols navies like to imagine them as. Now, to be fair to the Nakhimov, she's not the Moskva. The upgraded air defense suite is considerably more capable, with dozens of long-range air defense cells specifically meant to intercept exactly the kind of threats that killed Moskva: aircraft, cruise missiles, and drones. Russian messaging around this consistently frames Nakhimov as the direct answer to the Moskva humiliation. But here's the problem with that argument. Moskva wasn't sunk because Russia had bad missile defense doctrine on paper. She was sunk in large part because of failures in situational awareness, damage control, and fire suppression once she was hit. Reports at the time described a fire that spread largely unchecked before triggering magazine explosions that ultimately doomed the ship. Adding more interceptor missiles to a hull doesn't necessarily fix any of that. Arguably, if Russia had genuinely learned the lesson of Moskva, the smarter investment would have been in survivability and damage control systems rather than piling yet more offensive missile capacity onto an already enormous target. Then there's the concentration problem, and this is really the heart of the world's most expensive target argument. A navy built around a small number of irreplaceable capital ships is inherently brittle. Every ruble and every missile packed into the Nakhimov is capability that exists in exactly one place at one time, and none of it survives if that one hull goes down. Remember, Russia doesn't have a production line quietly building more Kirov-class cruisers in the background. The Nakhimov could become the only operational Kirov-class cruiser if Pyotr Velikiy is retired as currently expected. If Nakhimov is lost, damaged badly enough to need years of repair, or simply proves unreliable, Russia doesn't have a sister ship sitting nearby ready to pick up the slack. The entire Kirov-class experiment effectively lives or dies with this single vessel. And that concentration risk lands in a war where Ukraine has spent 4 years proving, again and again, that it doesn't need a traditional navy to make life miserable for Russian warships. Ukraine's own major service combatant, the frigate Hetman Sahaydachny, was scuttled in the opening days of the war, specifically to keep it out of Russian hands. And yet, despite starting the war with essentially no blue water navy at all, Ukraine has managed to drive the entire Russian Black Sea fleet into hiding. Following the Moskva sinking and a wave of uncrewed surface vessel strikes, including a notable attack on the naval base at Novorossiysk, Russian warships have been effectively confined to port, submarines included, with crews reportedly even submerging their boats at the pier just to reduce their visibility to drone reconnaissance. Analysts covering the Black Sea campaign have described those protective harbour walls at Novorossiysk as functionally turning into a cage for the fleet hiding behind them. The tools that did most of that work weren't a sophisticated new missile system, but cheap, largely uncrewed drone boats, essentially explosive-packed jet skis with a camera and a radio link, built and iterated rapidly and thrown at Russian ships and infrastructure in waves. And that's really the uncomfortable core of the argument against ships like Nakhimov in 2026. These uncrewed threats share one huge advantage: they're expendable. Nobody, not even Russian military bloggers, is going to celebrate footage of 40 Ukrainian drones getting shot down. But air defense only has to fail once, and the ship that took 27 years and billions of dollars to build is gone, while the weapon that did it might cost a few $1,000s to manufacture and required no crew to risk. That asymmetry, cheap and expendable versus expensive and irreplaceable, is exactly what's already humbled a Russian fleet once in this war, and it's the same problem that Nakhimov steps into the moment it enters full service. Now, geography still matters. Nakhimov is heading to the Northern Fleet, patrolling Arctic and subarctic waters around the Kola Peninsula, nowhere near the range of the small drone boats that have terrorized Russia's Black Sea fleet. Ukraine's naval drone campaign has been confined to the Black Sea, built around geography, proximity, and a very specific set of targets tied to the blockade of Ukrainian ports and the Crimean Peninsula. But even if Nakhimov never sees a Ukrainian drone boat in its operational life, the same fundamental vulnerability exists wherever it sails, because modern anti-ship missiles, long-range strike drones, and submarines don't respect the Arctic as some kind of safe harbor either, and Russia's Northern Fleet has hardly been immune to Western surveillance and NATO submarine activity for decades. What the Ukraine war really exposed wasn't a Black Sea problem specifically. Instead, it laid the groundwork for a different kind of naval power, one where the weapons are decentralized and limited to expendable, or at least relatively inexpensive drones. That's precisely because putting the Navy's capability into one irreplaceable hull creates a single point of failure, and one that foreign navies would be all too eager to abuse. It's also worth sitting with just how strange the numbers here really are once you line them up side by side. A ship laid down in the 1980s, mothballed for a full 2 decades before serious work even began, refit for over a decade after that, at a final cost that by some estimates approaches $5 billion. That's a sum of money that could have funded a genuinely modern fleet of frigates or corvettes, vessels that are far cheaper to build, far easier to replace if lost, and arguably far better suited to the kind of distributed, sensor-heavy, drone-saturated naval warfare that's actually defined this war. Instead, Russia chose to pour it all into resurrecting a single Cold War hull because that hull already existed, half-finished, sitting at Sevmash, and finishing it made for a cleaner propaganda story than starting something new from scratch. There's a certain grim logic to that decision. Sunk cost is a hell of a drug, but it's not obviously a strategy anyone would choose if they were designing a navy from first principles today. It's also worth remembering that Nakhimov isn't entering an empty stage. NATO has been steadily increasing its own attention of the Arctic and the waters the Northern Fleet calls home, with more frequent submarine patrols, expanded surveillance, and closer cooperation between Nordic navies since Finland and Sweden joined the alliance. A single battlecruiser, however heavily armed, doesn't erase any of that pressure, and it doesn't give Russia anything close to sea control in the region where NATO submarines have operated for decades. If anything, Nakhimov's real contribution may simply be forcing NATO planners to account for one more heavily armed hull in their targeting math, rather than fundamentally shifting the balance of power in the Arctic. Naval analysts covering this refit have not been shy about drawing that conclusion. Some went on to describe the entire program as bearing all the hallmarks of a so-called prestige or vanity project, one where the perception of strength matters more than actual combat effectiveness. The argument is that Nakhimov's realistic future is less about decisive naval combat and more about flag showing, demonstration cruises, and appearing impressively in naval parades and propaganda broadcasts. It's the exact kind of role that lets the Kremlin claim victory over a troubled program without ever actually testing the ship against a peer threat. Given how badly Russia's only aircraft carrier, the Admiral Kuznetsov, continues to embarrass the Navy with fires, crane collapses, and dry dock disasters, it's hard not to see why the Kremlin is eager for literally any large warship it can point to and call a symbol of restored Russian naval might, regardless of its actual usefulness. Then there's the harsh reality that after all that refit, Nakhimov doesn't really change the broader numbers game between Russia and NATO at sea. It's just one ship, and it can't be reproduced from scratch. The capability to do a refit doesn't solve Russia's problem where shipyards are churning out warship after warship to patrol the oceans. Nakhimov is basically a single, highly specialized, extremely expensive asset, optimized for a fairly narrow mission. And worse yet, Russia is mostly going to parade around as proof of its navy can still finish a mega project, conveniently glossing over just how badly that same project went for the better part of 3 decades. So, back to our original question. Did Russia actually pull off something genuinely ambitious here, or did it spend the better part of 30 years and several $billion building the world's most expensive target? The honest answer is probably somewhere uncomfortably in between. If the specifications and open source data are to be believed, Nakhimov is still an extraordinarily capable warship, and arguably one of the most heavily armed warships in existence. But there's the sheer scale of the investment, the decades of delay, the sacrificing of another similar ship to meet ever-changing deadlines, and the fact that it enters service in the middle of a war that it will do absolutely nothing in. In the end, it might be an expensive target that Ukraine, as evidenced by its ramped-up attacks on Russian ships, can't resist. Now, to learn more, check out this video, and make sure to like and subscribe to stay up to date with all the news of the war in Ukraine as it unfolds on the sea, over land, and in the air.